Hello, everybody. So, for today's class, you should have read Edgar Allan Poe's gruesome tale, The Black Cat. And we're going to talk a little bit about this and then have a short assignment that goes with this where we pair The Black Cat with the poem that you were supposed to read by Poe, Annabel Lee. So, let's get started. So, a quick overview of this presentation. We're going to look at a brief history of Edgar Allan Poe, a summary of the Black Cat, then an analysis of the Black Cat, and then I'm going to share some final thoughts that hopefully get you thinking and are good points for discussion. So starting with Poe's background. So we all know that Edgar Allan Poe writes very dark tales, but these tales that he writes are presumably from his rough upbringing. So he had a very difficult early and even middle and later life. So pretty much his entire life was just very difficult, and it's no wonder that he writes such dark tales. So it all started when his parents died when he was very young. So first his mother died, then his father died, and then he was adopted by the Allan family. And he had a really good relationship with them at first, but then the relationship began to be rocky, and he was kind of estranged from them for a few years. And this led to his lifelong struggle with drinking, which we will discuss a little further later on in comparison to the narrator of The Black Cat. But Poe married his cousin Virginia, and he was very happy. But she died of tuberculosis at age 25, so very early on. So it's like Poe could never quite get a break in his life. Something good would happen, and then it would immediately be combated by some tragedy. And he eventually died of congestion of the brain on October 7th, 1849. So, like I mentioned, his writing is very dark. So, he often writes about aristocratic madmen, self tormented murderers, and other deviant types. So, they're not really cheerful, romantic style poetry that we're talking about here with Poe. And this right here, this is Virginia Poe. So, this was his cousin who he married, and she was the one that died early on at age 25. Moving on to the Black Cat. So the Black Cat is first person point of view. It's told by a narrator who is about to be executed. And he's telling us, I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. I'm not making any of this up. I'm going to see if you, my reader, can try to make sense of what happened because I don't really understand how I got to be here. So we assume, is this his final confession before he's about to be executed? But the narrator, he begins by recalling how he loved animals. He was a sensitive, caring child. And then he got married, and he and his wife have many animals. She's also a fellow animal lover. And she actually got him a lot of animals, including their black tomcat, Pluto. And all of a sudden, because a series of life events that happen, the narrator becomes an alcoholic. And one night, when he's drinking in a fit of rage that he can't really describe, he cuts out the cat's eye. So he cuts out the cat's eye, but the cat Pluto survives. But after this point, the narrator just can't stand to look at Pluto because it reminds him of that night when he seemingly lost his sense of judgment. So he ties a rope around Pluto's neck and hangs him. So Pluto dies, and that same night, his house catches fire. And the only thing that remains is a single wall, the wall that his bed used to lean against. And the shape of a cat is burned onto that wall. So then a few weeks go by, and he's at a bar, the equivalent of a bar. So a new black cat appears to him at this bar, and this black cat looks exactly like Pluto, except it has a white patch of fur on its chest. And he takes this cat home. He asks the bartender, is this your cat? And he says no. So he takes the cat home, and then the patch of fur begins to resemble a gallows. So this is not good. So this is presumably foreshadowing what's going to happen to the narrator. But later on in the story, he is going down to his cellar, and he's tripped by the cat. and he tries to kill it with the axe, but his wife intercepts and says, no, don't hurt him, and he kills her instead. He hits her in the head with the axe. And he just completely shows no remorse. He bricks her body immediately into the wall, and he loses sight of the cat, and he thinks it's over with. And the police began to search for his missing wife, and they searched for days, and he's so sure of himself. He's so sure, he's almost cocky in his belief that he's not going to be found out. So he bangs on the wall where his wife is bricked up, and a growl comes out of it. So of course the police bust down the wall, they open it, and they find his wife with the black cat on her head, and the black cat's meowing at the narrator, kind of like, I told you, justice would be served. So let's break this down a little bit more. Let's talk about the narrator. So the narrator starts off the tale by saying he's not superstitious. He doesn't believe in fairy tales, the myth of, black cats being evil, and he never really takes responsibility for his actions. He's in denial about his own sanity. And this is really interesting to talk about. The fiend intemperance. He blames this sort of persona of evil. That's what he turns it into. That's who he says caused him to perform all these terrible deeds that he did, like cutting out the cat's eyes, hanging the cat, killing his own wife, and bricking her in the wall. So this is really important to talk about in terms of the temperance movement, so the historical context of the time. So the temperance movement was a period of time when there was a moderation of alcohol. And if you look to the right, this was actually propaganda for this time. Alcohol, a blessing, a curse, good for the engine, but not for the engineer, good for commercial purposes, but not as a beverage. So alcohol was kind of not exactly outlawed, but they were just trying to say, hey, we need a break from alcohol. So intemperance will be the opposite of temperance. So fiend intemperance, alcohol. Alcohol caused him to do it. He also talks about spirit of perverseness. That's another sort of persona that he uses to blame for his evil deeds. And he says he was in a jinn-nurtured state. So he really never takes responsibility. Now on to the black cat. So first we have Pluto. That's the name of the first black cat that started everything. And the name itself is interesting because Pluto was an ancient mythological god of the underworld. So there's some superstition right there. And then you have the house fire. So this is a quote from page 768 in the Norton Anthology of the text. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up. So everything, he lost everything in the house fire. So this house fire we know happened after Pluto the cat was killed. So we're assuming that this was sort of a revenge for killing the cat, especially since the image of the cat was the only thing that was left on the wall or of the house at all. So then you have the new black cat, and then we talked about the gallows. It's foreshadowing his own execution, but it's also a throwback to how he killed the first cat. He hung the first cat. And it's also very interesting that the cat ultimately is the one who gives him away in the end. And then just a quick side note, domestic abuse. This is very interesting to pair with this story because there is a link between cruelty to animals and domestic abuse. And I have linked an article here that you can go back and read. I'll put this in Canvas for you to go back and read that article. But to sum it up, typically verbally abusive at first, and then you become physically abusive to animals, to your spouse. And this is what happens to our narrator. He kills his wife. He's not even remorseful. And it causes us to wonder, was his wife's murder premeditated? And then finally, the murder and concealment. So he bricks his wife's body in the wall of the cellar, and he just so happens to have these materials that he needs lying around. So this is pretty suspicious that he just so happens to have brick and mortar. And why was his wife even going down in the basement with him in the first place? So was this premeditated? So the police, the fact that they come multiple times to search shows that the narrator is not trusted. And he's feeling so smug that he beats on the wall. And then the police open the wall and find his wife's body. So some final thoughts. This is a Gothic tale. There's a symbolic use of space, violent, and supernatural elements. This was published between the Telltale Heart and the Cask of
Lotto. So it starts and ends like the Telltale Heart. The narrators are both telling the readers they're not crazy, not making up the story, and are unable to resist showing off in front of the police. You have a body bricked into the wall like the cask of Amontillado, and then Poe's own alcoholism. Let's talk about that. Was this a cry for help? Poe's own cry for help for writing this story. And then finally, you have the symbol of the black cat, which is subverted as it's used as a source of justice instead of an evil being, as black cats typically are embodied as.